After Newfoundland and Labrador joined Canada in 1949, Joseph Smallwood became the new province's first premier. He announced that a major priority for his Liberal government would be to develop, diversify, and modernize the provincial economy. A central piece of that strategy was to build a hydroelectric generating station at Churchill Falls. Hydroelectric power is a form of renewable energy that uses the force of moving water, like a large waterfall, to generate electricity. One of the problems facing Smallwood was that the province did not have the expertise or the money to complete all of the industrial developments he envisioned. Smallwood decided to seek outside help. In 1952, he visited England to meet with a group of prominent British bankers and industrialists. He had a proposition. If he granted them large tracts of land in Newfoundland and Labrador, would they develop the natural resources? Led by the prominent Rothschild Group, a number of firms took Smallwood up on his offer. They formed a single consortium in 1953. A consortium is a group of individuals or companies who combine their resources to achieve a common goal, usually one that is far too large for any single member of the group to accomplish alone. The consortium that formed in 1953 became known as the British Newfoundland Corporation, or BRNCO for short. As promised, the Smallwood government granted BRNCO extensive land and water rights in Newfoundland and Labrador. Among them was the Churchill River and Falls. In 1958, BRNCO created a subsidiary company to develop the Churchill Falls project. It was called the Churchill Falls Labrador Corporation. BRNCO owned 80% of CFLco, but sold the remaining 20% to the Shawinigan Engineering Company, which was based in the province of Quebec. Developing the Churchill Falls posed a significant challenge. Chief among the difficulties was its remote location. To make a profit, the project would have to sell its electricity to the enormous markets that existed in Canada and the United States. But those markets were hundreds of kilometers away. Complicating matters even more was the fact that Churchill Falls electricity would have to cross the Quebec border to reach the markets it needed. To do that, CFLco had two options: negotiate an arrangement with Quebec, or convince the Canadian government to pass legislation that would allow CFLco to build a power corridor through Quebec. Ottawa was reluctant to intervene, so CFLco's most realistic option was to negotiate with Quebec. However, the Quebec government was not interested in any deal that would let CFLco transmit energy across its borders and into Ontario and the United States. Instead, it wanted its own public utility, known as Hydro-Quebec, to buy Churchill Falls power at the Labrador border. This would allow Hydro-Quebec to then sell that energy to Canadian and American consumers. Speaking to the media in 1965, the Quebec Premier Jean Lesage clarified his position. The absolute first condition since the beginning of negotiations, and this has never changed, is that Hydro-Quebec shall become the owner of all electricity from Churchill Falls that travels through the province of Quebec at its entry point into the province of Quebec. We will negotiate on no other grounds than this. Negotiations did take place on those grounds, but they were fraught with difficulties and tensions often erupted between the two premiers. There were three major stumbling blocks. One was the boundary separating Labrador from Quebec. It had been determined in 1927 by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, but the decision had been unpopular and much resented in Quebec. The boundary remained a sensitive issue well into the 1960s. During the Churchill Falls talks, Premier Lesage raised the possibility of changing the boundary as a requirement to develop the falls. Smallwood vehemently opposed any such possibility. A second problem was the ownership of CFLco. When negotiations began, BRNCO owned 80% of CFLco and the Shawinigan Engineering Company owned the remaining 20%. But in 1962, the Quebec government decided to nationalize all privately owned electricity generating companies in the province. As a result, Shawinigan's 20% stake in CFLco became the property of Hydro-Quebec. Brinko and Smallwood were both concerned that the change might create a conflict of interest in the negotiations between Hydro-Quebec and CFLco. As a result, Brinko developed a compromise under which the Newfoundland and Labrador government also assumed an ownership position in CFLco. The third stumbling block was money. How much could CFLco charge Hydro-Quebec for Churchill Falls hydroelectricity? The two sides could not reach an agreement, and talks temporarily broke down in 1964. A frustrated Smallwood investigated a new route for Churchill Falls power, one that would bypass Quebec altogether. Called the Anglo-Saxon Route, it proposed using subsea cables to move Churchill Falls energy from Labrador to the island of Newfoundland and then to the maritime provinces and the United States. But this option proved to be far too expensive and was ultimately abandoned. Despite the setbacks and political wrangling, negotiations eventually resumed between CFLco and Hydro-Quebec, although they moved at a slow pace. The two finally signed a 21-page letter of intent on October 13, 1966. A letter of intent is a document that precedes a formal contract. Generally speaking, it outlines what the parties involved have agreed to do, and it forms the foundation for the final contract. In the 1966 letter of intent, CFLco agreed to sell Hydro-Quebec about 90% of Churchill Falls power for 44 years. In return, Hydro-Quebec agreed to take on some of the financial risks associated with construction. The letter also stated that if Hydro-Quebec and CFLco wanted to renew the contract at the end of its lifespan, then they could negotiate new terms to do just that. The letter did not specify a time frame for the renewal period or a price for the hydroelectricity. It merely stated that the terms and conditions would be mutually agreed. According to the letter, Hydro-Quebec shall have the right to renew the definitive power contract for a further term of years from its expiry date upon such terms and conditions as to quantity and price as may be then mutually agreed. Construction proceeded at Churchill Falls soon after the letter of intent was signed in 1966. However, negotiations towards the final contract dragged on for another 3 years, far longer than anyone anticipated. With no contract in hand, CFLco and its parent company, Brinko, found it increasingly difficult to finance construction of the Churchill Falls project. They fell into dire financial straits. During this same period, CFLco agreed to significant concessions regarding the final contract, particularly regarding the renewal clause. Signed in May of 1969, the final contract gave Hydro-Quebec the right to purchase the majority of Churchill Falls electricity for a period of 40 years and at fixed prices, which would decrease over time. The price was set at approximately $3 per megawatt hour for the first 5 years. It would then decline in stages until it became approximately $2.5 per megawatt hour for the last 15 years. The contract also included an automatic renewal clause, which allowed Hydro-Quebec to buy Churchill Falls energy for another 25 years at the even lower price of $2 per megawatt hour. Scholars James Fian and Mel Baker point out that the final renewal clause was radically different from the one that had been set out in the letter of intent, and which had called for negotiation and mutual agreement on the terms of any renewal. According to Fian and Baker, the contract now provided for the automatic renewal, without signatures being required, with practically all the energy to be sold to Hydro-Quebec at $2 per megawatt hour for 25 years. Even in the context of 1968, that price was extraordinarily cheap. CFLco, which by then would have almost fully exhausted its finances, acquiesced to this and other concessions. The 1969 Churchill Falls contract remains a source of significant controversy in Newfoundland and Labrador, intensified by a surge in energy prices in the 1970s. Many scholars today agree that a major flaw in the contract was that it did not include an escalation clause that would have allowed the price to be reviewed if the market value of energy increased. Instead, CFLCO agreed to sell Churchill Falls power to Hydro-Quebec at fixed prices until 2041. As of 2019, the deal has yielded close to $28 billion in profits to Quebec, compared to just $2 billion for Newfoundland and Labrador. Over the decades, Newfoundland and Labrador has challenged the contract in various courts, but almost all have ruled in Hydro-Quebec's favor. An exception came in 2019 when a Quebec Court of Appeal imposed a monthly cap on the amount of Churchill Falls energy that Hydro-Quebec can sell after the 2016 renewal. When the Churchill Falls deal expires in 2041, full control of the hydroelectric project will be given to CFLCO.